So, what problems was Independent Sage trying to solve?
I set up Independent Sage at a point where the epidemic was barely being handled at all. And the object was twofold. One was to demonstrate how I believe science advice ought to operate within government, that is open and transparent. So our first couple of meetings were held in the public domain. And when we produce our reports, the reports are previously discussed with the public so that we get public views on them. I have a team of absolutely brilliant and very hardworking people. There's just a dozen of them, and but they cover the whole patch in the sense that we cover, of course, epidemiology, but we're not dominated by epidemiologists. We have healthcare experts, we have viral experts. We do cover the patch in a way, interestingly, that I don't think SAGE does. The main point is that we put our advice into the government, as SAGE does, but we also put our advice, as we put it into government, into the public domain. And the object is to demonstrate how trust can be developed with the public. I mean, what is interesting is the response of the media to the setting up of Independent Sage. We did not anticipate it, but we are on the media virtually every single day. And it's not just me, it's the members of the team out there talking on the media, television and radio programs. And this is very welcome, but let me explain why. And that is simply because those television producers know that if they approach members of government, including science advisors in government, including the chief medical officer, they always get turned down because the request has to go through the communications team in number 10, and quite simply the team doesn't allow people to go on television and radio and say what they think. And that's not the way to get the trust of the public. If you want the public to behave in such a way that we manage the pandemic, you have to have their trust.
That's interesting. So do you think that the government's response to the COVID crisis has damaged trust?
Oh, yes, I do. I mean, I think, for example, just yesterday in the House of Parliament, the leader of the opposition asked the Prime Minister what was being done with the test and trace system, because using government data, he was able to show that only 25% of new infected cases per day are actually being tested and traced. And clearly, that is no way to bring the epidemic to an end. The test and trace system is not operative. The response of the Prime Minister was to kind of deny the truth and then to bluster. Now, I think the members of Parliament on his side of Parliament who were there didn't look too happy at his response. I think the idea seems to be that if you tell the public everything is good, then it is good. And you have to keep repeating that until they believe you. Now, we are getting so many requests from people, please get out there and explain to us what we should be doing. How do we manage ourselves to remain healthy? What people have realized is that this is a deadly virus, but it's also a virus where if you go into hospital and you put into a ventilator, there are good chances that you will emerge with your lungs, if you live, that you will emerge with your lungs scarred for life, which means you will never get a lot of breath, and that really reduces your activity very substantially. So it's a pretty awful disease, and people are becoming aware of this and really concerned about the amount of virus going around the country. I mean, let me just say today, the government figures are that 1,000 new viral cases are happening every single day. 1,000. If I can tell you, if we were right at the beginning of the epidemic and it was 1,000 new cases a day, we would be going into total lockdown. So how does it make sense at this point in time to come out of lockdown? The only answer to that is that we would have a fully operative find, test, trace, isolate, and support system. So let me just run through that. Find. We need to find every new case. I expect to see advertisements at every street corner, in every newspaper, on every television program, telling people what the symptoms are, and then saying, if you are suffering from these symptoms, contact the following. Give us numbers and make sure you are given a test right away. If the test is delayed for 4 or 5 days, that's 4 or 5 days when the contacts are in contact with other people. We need the test results back within 24 hours. Now, the reason this is, and the support at the end of my list. Isolate means everyone who's been in touch with that person has to be put into isolation. Well, wait a minute. Many people, particularly in deprived areas, can't go into isolation. They've got big families living in, small accommodation. We need to requisition hotels, create places where people can be isolated, make sure they get food, water, tea, make sure they get pharmaceuticals. If we're keen to get this epidemic done and dusted so we can get our economy up and running again, that's what we should be doing. Unbelievably, it wasn't until April, remember this is a pandemic that started in January, that the government announced a new test and trace system was being developed through the private sector. Now, these companies that are running this have no prior knowledge of the health sector at all. We have a healthcare system, publicly funded, dotted around the entire country. We have these healthcare systems in local communities, GPs, we have school nurses, we have this whole system in place, which is ignored by these private companies. Now, if I say to you, actually, I don't believe it's 1,000 new cases a day, the MRC unit here in Cambridge has estimated it's 4,000 today, right? 4,000 yesterday. So it's somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000. That sounds like a very large number if you're a company trying to manage this from London. But imagine you break it down into small local communities. It becomes a very small daily number for you to deal with. So it can be dealt with very quickly. Incredibly, we've put our advice into government and they're just persisting with this process. The woman who was put in charge of it, Baroness Dido Harding, announced in Parliament she didn't think that her system would be fully up and running until September. So why are we coming out of lockdown now when the virus is still so extensive in the country? So I can only say that if we had a proper test and trace system up and running and we stayed in lockdown for another 3 weeks, we could then probably come out of lockdown comfortably. So.
No, interesting what you're saying around sort of commandeering hotels. I'm a trustee for a homeless organisation in Manchester, and that's what we did here.
Right.
Particularly as the hotels weren't being used at the time, there was a spare resource, it worked well, but now with the reopening economy, we're about to see a lot of homeless people be pushed back onto the streets, as you say, they can't self-isolate. So yeah, there's problems coming from that. So as a highly esteemed scientist, do you feel that you have a good understanding of the government's strategy in response to the pandemic?
I don't think anyone has a good understanding of the government strategy. The word strategy doesn't seem to apply to what they're doing. And I know that sounds very critical, but let me say, at the beginning, it was very clear that the policy announced by the Chief Scientific Advisor to the British public on television, standing alongside the Prime Minister, said the strategy is herd immunity. And herd immunity means 70, 80% of us get the disease, develop the antibodies or die. And once we have antibodies or dead, we can't get it again. And that means that we emerge from the epidemic with all of the antibodies in place in the British population and the disease goes away. The estimate of the number of people who would die wasn't difficult to make. We knew from China what the death rate is per head of population that gets the disease. And so to say it would have been 200,000 to 500,000 is a very easy calculation. if the government was following that route, that's a pretty deadly route to take. That 500,000 extra deaths, I mean, this is like a major war in which the country is really being decimated. So that was untenable, but it took the SAGE group a long time to do a full computer analysis, which, it took ages to get it up and running. So it's mid-March before the analysis emerges. Could be 200 to 500,000 people dying. Unbelievable. It's not rocket science, right? And then we spend another week without going into lockdown. Now, if the idea is we couldn't put up with that number of fatalities, then you go into lockdown right away because the disease was spreading at a rate that was amounting to doubling every 3 to 4 days. That means a week is a quadrupling period. Now, wait a minute. That means if we have 50,000 deaths today, we have 35,000 deaths that could have been avoided just by making a decision 1 week earlier. But there's something much worse to it than that. The longer you leave it, even a few days, the more virus there is in the country, the longer the lockdown takes. And so it hits our economy. And all of this talk about, well, think of the economy. People are saying to me, Sir David, are you thinking about the economy? Absolutely. There's no challenge between the two, managing the epidemic and getting the economy up and running. We have to do both as quickly as possible. So, no, I can't see strategy at the moment. It seems that we might be in denial, to say we've got the best test and trace system in the world when it's probably the worst. It seems awfully like maybe I shouldn't use the word denial. It looks like they're still in electioneering mode. It doesn't look like they're bothered with the truth.
So just jumping back to the trust thing, is it reasonable to suggest that because trust has potentially been damaged in government, the public's reaction to the guidelines has not had the uptake it's wanted? We're seeing sort of cultural wars around masks, and then we're maybe leading up as to when the app emerges. We've seen some countries where there's been limited uptakes in the app. Is it reasonable to assume that the government's approach has damaged how the public engages with how to solve the problem?
Yes, so two things have been lost in terms of trust. Trust in the science. We've now got an uphill battle because the government kept saying we're following the advice of the scientists. When it comes to undoing the lockdown at the moment, I've seen the SAGE report that went into government just a few weeks ago. There's no difference between what they say in that report about the 2 meters to 1 meter rule compared with what my group is saying out in the open. But that report wasn't immediately put into the public domain. And the government then waited and waited. And then the Prime Minister is able to stand there with these two scientists, one on either side of him, and it looks as if they agree with him. They didn't say they agreed with him, but it just looks as if they do. So there's trust in the science, which is a very dangerous place to be. And there's also trust in the government. And you put that together, and people are very questioning what they should do. Now, I can tell you the independent SAGE has been asked by a group of people in the public domain, could you, because the government is no longer having its daily brief, they've said, well, could you do a brief for the public so you can tell us what we should be doing, what is going on? Now, for me, that's too grandiose. I don't want to slip into hubris here. I'm not in government. I can't play that role. But nevertheless, there's a sense in which a large group of people, having seen us all on television and radio, are listening to us. And that's a big hope. I'm an optimist. I hope they are, because we will explain what to do when it comes to July the 4th, if the government is retaining its policy then. I'm hoping very much that sense prevails still within government.
Okay. And so what difference do you think if we had sort of open data standards across the country what difference might that have made to our response and our ability to sort of handle the crisis?
Let me take you back to when I became Chief Scientific Advisor. It's way back, 20 years ago. And we were just coming to the end of another infectious disease epidemic in this country. In British cattle, we had BSE, mad cow disease. And during that epidemic, we had the Minister of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries going on television giving his daughter a hamburger, very famously. I know both of them very well, and saying, "Look, folks, it's safe to eat. I'm feeding my own daughter." And it turned out that the scientific community, already within government as well as outside, was saying, hold on, variant CJD is emerging, and it may well come from people eating British beef that has got BSE. The result of that was a commission set up to examine how well or badly the government handled that epidemic. And the commission, Phillips Commission report, states very clearly, chief scientific advisors ought to be independent voices in government. They ought to be able, in their own right, to go on television and radio and explain what their advice is to government in an open and honest way. And that is the condition on which I took the job as Chief Scientific Advisor. Blair and Brown both knew very well that I expected to be able to walk into television studios and radio studios without hinder, so that I could explain the advice I was putting into government. Now, it does mean it's a very big challenge for the Chief Scientific Advisor, because what you don't want to do is give unnecessary advice where the politicians are simply going to say, forget it, because you lose your credibility with the politicians. You're balancing a line between keeping the trust of the cabinet and keeping the trust of the public. And that was a very sort of sobering way for me to operate. But it was successful, and I can tell you that quite simply over the 7-8 year period when I was Chief Scientific Advisor, if you measure public trust in scientists, doctors, politicians, etc., journalists, you will see that trust in science went soaring up, whereas before, trust in science during the BSE crisis had really collapsed. So that was a condition that I thought every Chief Scientific Advisor had to accept, that they would be open to go out onto the public domain. That, to me, is extraordinarily damaging. In 2010, when the coalition government came in under David Cameron, that was removed. I was brought in to run the climate negotiations from the Foreign Office. Within my first week, I had 7 media requests to go on the media to explain what I would be doing. The Foreign Office minister said to me, wonderful, we've got a talking head on the government dealing with climate change. You can tell the British public all the good things we're doing on climate change. I wasn't allowed to. I wasn't allowed to even once, because it turned out that people in number 10 thought that the British public didn't like what we were doing on climate change, and it wouldn't be popular, it wouldn't be a good electioneering process. That's, to me, abandoning leadership, but it was also abandoning the principle of open and honest scientific advice.
So do you think that position currently in government is tenable? Is that balance between maintaining credibility and the trust in the public whilst maintaining effective relationships with cabinet? Do you feel that's still a rope that is able to be walked?
You see, of course, we've got a government that has got an 80 majority in Parliament. We've got a government that knows it's got another 4, even 5 years to run, not quite 5. And so I think they're super confident that once this epidemic is over, by herd immunity or by vaccines or whatever means, I don't think they're fully aware of how they do that, that they will emerge in time for the next election with somehow an economy that is burgeoning and growing rapidly. Now, I say somehow because the pandemic, I think, has the potential to very severely harm our economy. And the reason I say that is because I want to see this virus removed from this country. I want to see net zero new viral cases, as happened in Spain, by the way. Spain had 5-6 days of net zero deaths. We are still at over 100 deaths a day. And that's when they went out of lockdown. We need to be in that sort of place, because I fear that come the winter, this virus may well spread in the way that a normal flu virus spreads in the winter, and we would have a second wave. And I fear then, of course, our economy takes longer to recover than almost every other country. By the way, I kind of fear for Spain, having really worked hard to get rid of the virus and then opening their doors to British visitors.
Yeah, once everybody starts to open up again, it'll be interesting how that's all managed. Notable that I think it was Greece and Denmark who have both spoken about potentially restricting access from the UK.
Yeah.
So yeah, just jumping back to, do you think open data would have made a difference to how we handle this, particularly as far as enabling sort of local regions to better, understand their problems, address specific spikes, that kind of thing? Would that make a difference?
Open data is critically important, but of course you need the data. And how many new infections per day? I've already raised that question. We don't actually know because we're not testing enough people. But testing people should only be done for people who have the symptoms. And we're not advertising this. One of my colleagues felt she had the symptoms, and so she contacted the National Health Service, and they sent her to a website, and the website didn't mention the need to get a test, didn't even mention it. So there's no advertisement, there's no sense in which they're trying to gather the data so that they can bring it under control. Yes, of course, open data, critically important.
And it's curious that the government still doesn't provide the actual figure for how many people have been tested per day. What's your explanation for that?
I think the main point is the following. They've given out figures, 200,000 a day. They've given out these figures. And then when you dig into it, you find actually because the tests were conducted by non-healthcare people, the people were given the device to get the swabs covered with the virus, if you've got the virus. Now, what you're told is, don't touch your tongue, don't touch the roof of your mouth. You have to get it down into your tonsils to get it. Needless to say, a large percentage of the tests actually proved unworkable, but they were still counted as tests. Right? So what you actually mean is, how many successful tests have you run on different people, not repeat tests on the same person? And in a way, that's the wrong question. What percentage of the people who are estimated to be new infections per day are we testing, tracing, putting into isolation? That's the question we want to know the answer to. And of course, we haven't got even close to that, which was the confrontation between Boris and Keir yesterday in Parliament.
So it was interesting that you noticed the challenge of having a politician flanked by two scientists. Do you have a concern about that approach? As a scientist yourself, I expect you've been in similar positions, whether the politician is trying to deliver a particular line, a message which may not be exactly aligned with what you would like to do. How do you manage that?
To be quite honest, I could not do that if I was in government. So please let me go out there and explain. And if the Prime Minister said to me, no, you explained it to me, I can do it, just stand next to me so I can show that I'm just saying what you've told me, I would be extremely worried. And I'm quite sure the Prime Minister has said things that have made those two guys really uncomfortable. So during that foot and mouth disease crisis, once I had put forward to Tony Blair a plan to bring it under control, he simply said to me, right, I'm handing over control of this to you because we politicians don't understand the science. And that means you're going on television and radio to explain every day what you're doing. And that's what I did. The country that's got out of this in Europe most successfully is Greece. Greece the Prime Minister announced back in February to the population on radio and television that he was handing it over to his science advisors. And the science advisors and the Prime Minister, but every 6 p.m., they were on television and radio explaining what they were doing. Greece went into lockdown at the beginning of March, 4th of March. But they had, prior to that, sent ships to China to get the equipment they needed for their hospitals so they could manage the epidemic. They followed every bit of guideline the WHO had given them. Unbelievably, we didn't do anything at all. And so what am I saying? The science advisors were clearly running the show in Greece. And that is right. If you think that the politicians could make a better decision than the scientists when faced with something like an epidemic, then think again. So I know what they were wanting to do was to keep running the economy, and our economy would fire away while the rest of the world was floundering. Exactly the opposite is now happening. Our economy is going to be one of those very hard hit. It's not the only one. Brazil under Bolsonaro, United States under Trump, very, very seriously still on the rise. And there are other parts of the world as well. But just look at the countries that are handling this. You may not know this. I'm a senior strategy advisor to the president of Rwanda.
Spotted it on the website the other day. Yeah, interesting.
So basically, the School of Government in Oxford has set up a list of countries, all countries, in order of how well they've handled the pandemic. 190 countries. Rwanda is third on the list. They've really handled it without any deaths occurring of people within country, and they've shut down their borders. They did everything right.
I was going to say, so what did they do? Because my only real connection with Rwanda is I know they try and position themselves as the Silicon Valley of Africa. They're quite advanced in terms of digital things. Is that had an impact, or is it more just following the science?
So they have health centers in every community. And what this means, and the health centers were built by local communities. There's something called Umaganda Labor. Every fourth Saturday of the month, every able-bodied person has to go back to their community. And the government decided to persuade communities to build health centers. Now, they take ownership of it. Child mortality collapsed because Rwanda is now head of the list in the world of countries that have a high vaccination rate of small children, because they proudly own these health centers they've built. Now, of course, it's through the health centers that the whole system of operating the pandemic has worked. And yes, it is the Silicon Valley of Africa. And yeah, I'm very, very proud of how that country is managing. If I take this list, fourth from the bottom of the whole world is the United Kingdom.
And if you were asked to explain how or why that happened, what would you say?
Well, you've already drawn that out of me. I think we haven't seen a strategy emerging from government that is coherent, that is government-wide, that is using local communities. Schools are an essential part of local communities. How much interaction was there between government and schools on this whole process of going back to school, reopening schools? We're not using GPs. It's an incredibly poor system. Inventing a private sector process in the middle of a massive pandemic, the worst we've had in 100 years. Unbelievable.
There does seem to be this kind of centralized private approach rather than trying to leverage existing systems and support networks. I know you've kind of touched on it, but what's your brief explanation for why you might take that approach rather than the one you would suggest?
I think it's quite simply that the government comes in with a belief that the private sector is always better than the public sector. And I'm not going to argue whether this is right or wrong. I mean, I have a view, but I'm not going to argue that. But I think when you are faced with a crisis, and the worst crisis for 100 years in terms of an epidemic, that's not the time to test this process. By the way, Serco, the company that really is running the process, has failed several times, not least in the Olympic Games. So I think there's a touch of dogma underlying this. I'm afraid I've got something else on now.
Okay, my friend, do you have
Yeah.
one time for one last question before you disappear? I just want to quickly touch on your work in regards to climate, and just kind of curious what you think sort of a radically transparent approach or better support for open data could mean for a better understanding of climate change and empowering and encouraging the public to support, the changes that we make to try and, save the earth, essentially.
I think climate change is one area where open data is there. I mean, for example, I think everyone is fully aware that northern Russia, Siberia, is now experiencing temperatures of 35, 36 degrees in the middle of their summer, which is unprecedented, 18 degrees higher than you would expect. Extraordinarily dangerous because there's a lot of methane trapped up there in the permafrost, and that can only be released at high temperatures. I think we're all aware of all of the damage occurring around the world from climate change events. I have set up a center here at Cambridge for climate repair, and I am getting a lot of people listening to what we're saying about climate repair. Climate repair is 1, deep and rapid emissions reduction. 2, remove greenhouse gases that are already there. We are at a total of 500 parts per million greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, CO2 equivalent today, and we need to bring that down to 350 or less to have a safe world in the future. And that is a very big target. We're aiming to see that we can get the technologies together to remove 35 to 40 billion tons of greenhouse gases per year. And that would still take 30 to 40 years. And the third aspect is to refreeze the poles and refreeze the Himalayas, find the technologies that can do that. There's a program. I won't ever set out the risks without giving a program of tackling it. And we are getting a lot of people listening. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has interfered with that process.
Okay, wonderful, David. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real privilege. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll quickly follow up with what I plan to do next with the interview by email.
Thank you, Robin. I look forward to seeing it.
All the best. Take care, my friend.
Bye.